So I'll be talking about pipits and just pipits. The illustrations that I'm going to show you are from this book here, which was published in 2002, maybe 2003 perhaps. And it covers both pipits and wagtails, all the species in the northern, almost northern hemisphere. And what I'm going to talk about is just very, very briefly the relationships about pipits, where they belong in the phylogeny. Also, what is a pipit versus a lark? How do you distinguish between pipits and larks? And then next, some identification tips, and I will focus on the larger species because they are probably the more difficult ones to identify, and I don't have the time to go through everything in detail. So what is a pipit then? Here's a phylogenetic tree showing all these little brown things, brown streaky things being pipits. And they are most closely related to the wagtails down here. But actually, if you look closely at this tree, there's some very, very strange things. Look here. Right in among the pipits, right in among those brown streaky things are two brightly colored African groups of birds. And even more strange, this one here, the madanga, which is endemic to the island of Buru and which was considered a white eye. You all know the Indian white eye? This was considered to be a close relative of the white eyes. It climbs around in trees, almost like a nuthatch. Completely different from all the pipits. Totally unexpected until we did some DNA work on that. Also, I'm not going to talk about wagtails, but since this tree is here, if you look at this little thing, it's called the Sao Tome short-tail or Sao Tome long-billed. That is a wagtail. It's endemic to the island of Sao Tome of West Africa, and it doesn't look anything like a wagtail. It occurs inside forests, and it's just totally different. So this is a truly amazing group of birds. So how do you distinguish between a pipit and a lark? Well, in general, larks are stockier. Some of the larks are really, really big, much bigger and heavier than any pipit. They've usually got shorter tails. They've got broader wings when you see them in flight, broader, more rounded wings when you see them in flight. Often in larks, the wings are very strongly patterned, unlike in pipits. Also, in most larks, the bill is heavier. This is an oriental skylark, which has got a relatively thin bill, but most larks have got stronger bills because they feed on both insects and seeds, unlike pipits, which are only insectivorous. The larks are usually much less mobile than pipits. They don't run around quite so quickly as pipits. They sort of often sit down, they squat rather much. Often they don't move at all. And if you look at the head pattern here, pipits have always got the same head pattern with a distinct supercilium, dark ear covered, usually with a dark moustachial stripe here, and a pale sub-moustachial and a dark malar stripe, whereas larks are more slightly differently patterned on the head. So they're actually quite easy to separate. There are two main groups of pipits which are useful for general identification purposes, and also actually these are they form different clades in the different groups in the phylogenetic tree. When we wrote this book, we referred to them as large pipits and small pipits. And the large pipits all have unstreaked flanks, whereas the small pipits all have some streaks on the flanks, at least some streaks. And all of the small pipits are at least in winter plumage, streaked on the breast as well, whereas at least the tawny pipit can be almost unstreaked on the breast. Also, this is just a tiny detail, but if you look at the tertial spacing here, all pipits have got 3 tertials that reach to or very close to the tip of the folded wing. And the spacing here is different. There's a very small gap between the second and the third tertial in these large pipits, whereas the small pipits have got all widely spaced tertials. When it comes to pipit identification, it's often thank you very much. I don't have to scream so much. It's often very useful to know something about aging and mold in pipits. And all pipits start out with a juvenile plumage. In the small pipits, the juvenile plumage is very similar to the adults. It's on average less distinctly streaked, and especially on the flanks, there's often less distinct prominent streaking on the flanks. But the large pipits all have very different juvenile plumages. So here's a juvenile Richard's pipit, and you see it's all very heavily marked on the upper part. So every single feather is dark with a thin, pale fringe. So it looks very scaly, the plumage. And this plumage is only worn a very, very short period. Then they rapidly start to mold. So this bird has started to mold, and you can see some new, all brown feathers here on the scapulars, and also a few new breast feathers, still looking mainly like a juvenile. But this bird has now replaced all of its head, upper parts, under parts, but retained the wing. So the entire wing in this bird is still juvenile feathers, but all the rest of the plumage is adult type. So we call this first winter plumage. And here's another example of a bird in first winter plumage, which has actually molted a few more feathers. So this bird has molted also, see how many? Two median coverts here. These are the median coverts. So you see there are 2 feathers with very buffy, warm, brownish tips, and the others have whitish tips, like in the juveniles. And same here, it's replaced the inner greater covert and retained the outer greater covert. So there's a clear contrast in color. Then, when this bird is in its first spring, so late first winter, when the bird is approximately half a year old, it will start to mold into an adult plumage. And then it will replace, it usually replaces quite many feathers. So sometime during the winter, usually all of the secondary coverts and tertials are replaced along with the head and body plumage. So then technically it's an adult bird. And then after the breeding season, they have a complete mold. They mold everything, every single feather usually, and they become like this. So this is the transition from juvenile through first winter to first spring, first summer to adult. Paddyfield pipit is a very common Indian bird. It's distributed all over India more or less, and it occurs in the plains, in some places a little bit up in the hillsides. It's a very distinctive bird, very long legs, often standing very upright, a bit like a giraffe. Rather strong bill, as in all the large pipits, no streaking on the flanks, but distinct streaking on the breast, fairly distinct streaking on the upper parts. And I was supposed to hear some sound here, but I don't, so I'll try again. there is obviously something wrong with the sound. I think I'll just plug in my own speaker and see if that works, because this doesn't seem to work. Is the staff awake there? Just tell them there's no sound, so just ask them to check if it's switched on, otherwise I'll just try to connect my own speaker. So, when I do like this, it should sound. Thank you. It's working. It's working. It's working. It's okay. Okay, so that was the song of the Paddyfield Pipit. I'll just play it again because you may not have heard it very clearly. So when the Paddyfield Pipit sings, it flies up into the air and it flies around for a little bit and then it drops down while singing. So how do you separate a Paddyfield Pipit from a Richard's Pipit? Well, they can be very difficult because they are very similar, and in fact they were considered the same species. Richard's Pipit does not breed in India, but it winters extensively in India, mainly in the eastern parts, but actually in large parts of India. And the Paddyfield Pipit is a smaller bird, smaller than Richard's. Proportions are very similar, except that Paddyfield's got a relatively shorter tail than Richard's Pipit. Sorry, I forgot to put a marker here, but the tail is, relatively speaking, shorter. And the main distinguishing plumage character is, if you look at the upper parts, the Richard's Pipit is more heavily striped on the upper parts, more blacker stripes on the upper parts. Also, very many Paddyfield Pipits have got a very distinct, thin, dark laurel stripe, so between the eye and the bill, a very thin, dark stripe. But that can be lacking. It's never present in Richard's, but in some individuals and from some angles, Richard's might seem to have a dark stripe on the lores, but it's never a really distinct dark stripe like this. And conversely, many Paddyfield Pipits don't have any stripe at all, so that's a variant feature. If you do see a distinct dark stripe on the lores, it's very likely to be a Paddyfield Pipit. The calls are the best means to distinguish between them. So here's Paddyfield. Just very short chips. And Richard's is here. It's much more drawn out, much more harsh, very different. I hope you agree with me. Now these are also difficult. So as I said, Richard's Pipit does not breed in India, but it winters extensively. Blyth's Pipit also winters extensively in India and likewise doesn't breed here. It breeds mainly in Mongolia. And as you can see, they are very, very similar to each other. Blyth's Pipit is slightly larger than Paddyfield Pipit. Again, tail is proportionately shorter. Unlike in Paddyfield Pipit, the legs are proportionately shorter than in Richard's. It's got a shorter neck as well, so when it stands up and when it stretches its neck, it doesn't look as giraffe-like as a Richard's Pipit. And if you look at the bill, the shape of the bill is actually usually noticeably different. In Blyth's Pipit, it's more sort of triangular. It's rather deep-based, but then it tapers into a fairly distinct point, whereas Richard's is slightly more decurved, slightly more thrush-like, at the upper mandible. It's slightly more decurved. But there is some overlap actually, and it can be really, really difficult. Streaking on the head, on the crown. Richard frequently has a darker stripe on the side and less distinct streaking on the central crown, whereas Blyth is similarly heavily striped throughout. Also the mantle, Blyth is slightly more heavily striped. When you see the birds from in front, but not so much from the side, but from a front view, a typical Richard's pipit has got a clear contrast between the breast and the belly, whereas a typical Blyth is more uniformly colored. It is, however, important to remember that all colorations in pipits and other birds is affected by wear and bleaching. So as time progresses, as the plumage becomes more and more worn, the colors will change. So when they're fresh, they're more rufous, more warmly colored, more buffish, and then gradually become more grayish and whitish. So a worn Richards would be very uniformly colored on the underpart. So I've saved the best feature until last. Look at the wing bars. In a fresh Blyth pipit, the greater coverts and medium coverts show very clear-cut, rather pale buffish tips, whereas in Richards, the wing bars are much less clearly defined for two reasons. First, the tips are more buffish, and second, the dark centers are less clear-cut and less sharply defined. So you get less distinct wing bars here. But again, I want to just stress that with wear, a Richard's pipit will become paler, will have paler, more distant wing bars, and also, as you remember, I hope, from the first slide, young birds have got white wing bars. So young Richard's pipits have got white wing bars. So you should really make sure what is the age of the feathers you're looking at. Is it a juvenile feather or is it a post-juvenile feather, an adult type feather? That is important. So, excuse me, just look at the details here. Richard's got more triangular dark centers that are more diffuse on the edges, whereas Blyth is more clear-cut, like this, more clear-cut and more square. Same on the greater coverts, actually. And of course, there is some individual variation. All these on the top row are Blyths, and those are Richards. So there is some variation, but I would say 99%, 98, 99% are distinguishable by this feature if you look carefully. One feature that's been put forward in the literature in the old days was the tail pattern, and there are average differences between Richards and Blyths. So this is the second outermost tail feather here, this one. So they've got, this is the outermost tail feather on one side, so second outermost, same here. And as you can see here, Richards has usually got much more white than Blyths, but as you can see, there is some overlap. So for example, this bird here has got much less white than this bird there, for example. So that's not a really reliable feature, although there are average differences. Of course, in the field you can't measure the birds, but if you could, or if you happen to catch one, you can measure the hind claw, and there are at least on average differences between them. Richard's got a longer hind claw. In first winter plumage, you really you can't use the pattern of the coverts because they are the same. You see, these individuals have got retained juvenile wings. So the entire wings here are retained juvenile. The rest of the plumage is first winter plumage. All these feathers have been molted, but these have been retained. So they've got these juvenile white-tipped feathers, which also in Richards look fairly similar to adult Blyths. But you have to rely on the structural differences. So shorter tail, shorter legs, shorter hind claw, more pointed bill. more heavy streaking above, more uniform colored underparts. And actually also the face of Blyth, it's difficult to put the finger on it, but the face of Blyth generally looks slightly more gentle. It could be an effect of the build pattern, but on average the supercilium is less distinct behind the eyes. It looks nicer. And actually, often when you flush a Blyth's pipit and it flies off, you won't think of a Richard's pipit, you won't think of a really big pipit, because it often gives the impression of a much smaller bird, of a small pipit, because it's relatively lighter and relatively shorter tailed. Calls. Richard. And now listen carefully. Here's Blyth. So did you hear? Blyth has got two different types of call. One is very similar to Richard's, but I think with practice it's 100% character. But it takes some practice, and I know that I've shown people. I remember one time in China I was leading a bird tour, and I saw Blyth's pipit, and I told them, "Now, listen, when I flush this bird, you will immediately hear the difference." And I flushed the bird, and some people said, "No, sorry, I can't hear the difference." So it does take some practice, but with practice, I would say they are 100% distinguishable by call. And Richards never gives that little chup, chup, chup call that you heard from Blyth's. So very often, when you flush a Blyth's, it would fly up and give this pew call, which is shorter and slightly more nasal than Richards, less harsh, and then after some time, maybe chup, 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 chup after that. Or it would just fly off and say chup, chup, or just pew. So there's variation, but very often you hear both types, and both are typical. I will play them again, different individuals this time. So first Richards. The last call there was actually cut a little bit. I must have made a mistake when I put that recording on. So here's Blyth's. Did you hear any difference? Excellent. You need to practice. But if you hear that little chup, 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 you can be absolutely certain that it's a Blyth. If it's not a Tawny Pipit, because Tawny Pipit's also got that little chop note, as well as Paddyfield. But anyway, Richards never does. So here's just Blyth's pipit on the side here, and Richards. And this is really typical, a typical classic stance of Blyth's pipit. Sort of fairly sort of horizontal, whereas this is a classic Richards giraffe-like. But look at this. They don't always stand like this. So this is a very alert, feeding Richards. And this is a very, very relaxed Richards. It's just taking it easy. And this Blyth, on the contrary, is slightly more alert than this bird here. So look at the differences in proportions. This bird looks fairly long-legged, but this is really incredibly long-legged and long-necked. Also note here the difference in these are all adult birds. So you see here very clear, distinct pale wing bars, very indistinct wing bars. Same here and there. Tawny Pipit is also a common winterer in India, and especially in the northern part, and it likes really dry areas. Richards prefers fairly wet areas, actually. Fairly long, tall grass and fairly damp areas. That's the favorite habitat of Richard's pipit. Whereas Tawny Pipit favors really dry, open, sandy, stony areas. And Tawny Pipit is very, very poorly streaked on the upper part in adult and first winter plumage. Very, very little streaking. And it's usually very poorly marked on the breast, just a few dark spots on the sides here, unlike all the others that I've shown so far. But you should remember that sometimes there's actually quite distinct spots on the breast in a tawny pipit, even in an adult bird. In first-fruit birds, like this bird here, this bird has got a few juvenile scapulars retained, and actually you can't tell that, but these breast feathers are actually retained juvenile as well. So here's a juvenile bird, a classic juvenile large pipit with heavily marked scaly upper part. And one important character of tawny pipit is the very distinct dark lores. You see here, very distinct dark laurel stripe. That's always present in tawny pipit. But that's also present in this pipit, the long-billed pipit, which is the largest of the pipits in India. And this is the subspecies Jerdoni, which breeds in northwestern India, in Kashmir, for example. And there's another subspecies down in the south of India, which I haven't got any illustrations of. I've actually never seen it in the field. I've only seen a few specimens. There are very few specimens available of that one. That's the nominate subspecies, which could, as we were discussing today, might be a different species. Nobody knows very much about it. So again, you've got good opportunities to provide new data, new information for science. Take that opportunity. And the long-billed pipit is characterized by very long tail. It's a big, heavy bird, long tail, fairly heavy, stout, thrush-like bill. It does have a dark laurel stripe, but it's slightly different from the laurel stripe of tawny pipit. We'll show another picture later. But it's also very deeply colored on the underparts, very plain on the upper parts and very deeply colored on the underparts, especially this subspecies Jerdoni. It's a juvenile bird on the right. And juveniles are slightly less dark on the upper parts than juveniles of other large pipits. So here's a comparison between tawny pipit up here and long-billed pipit. And in this case I chose the subspecies Decaptus, which is breeding further west. But it does actually, birds looking like Decaptus winter in India also, up in the northwestern parts of India. But Jerdoni is much more widespread. So Decaptus compared to Jerdoni is paler on the underparts, more tawny pipit-like. Here's a Jerdoni on the here. And so if you look at the underparts, they're always most deeply colored here. So it progressively becomes darker towards the rear end, whereas tawny pipit is invariably most buffy on the breast and sometimes flanks as well. But undertail coverts are usually the palest part. Undertail coverts and belly is usually the palest part, unlike this one. Also, the head pattern is less distinct in the long-billed pipit. You see, it's got two different types of call. So that second type, the tip tip tip, is actually quite similar to Blyth's and Paddyfield. The first type can be confused with Blyth's pipit, but it's less clean, it's less clear. It's usually more throaty, unclear, less clean sounding. And long-billed, very different. Almost like a crossbill, if you're familiar with crossbill calls. So very different calls. And long-billed has only got that type of call in the winter quarters. So the last two large pipits, Upland pipit, which breeds in the Himalayas and sub-Himalayan areas. It's a resident bird, so it only drops down a little bit in elevation, if at all. And so it's never seen down in the plains. So there's really no risk of confusion with any of the other large pipits down in this area. It's got a very strong bill, and it's heavily striped. Also on the flanks, actually. I told you before that the large pipits don't have streaks on the flanks. Sorry, I lied there, because this one does actually have some very thin dark stripes on the flanks. And yeah, it likes really hilly, mountainous areas. Yeah, I realized that I lied even more, because this one has got strongly striped flanks, but that's only because it's not a large pipit. It's just large in size. The Nilgiri pipit, which is endemic to the Western Ghats area, is actually large in size, but it's more closely related to the tree pipit and olive-backed pipit we just recently found out in a genetic study. So it's large in size and it's striped on the flanks, just like the small pipits, but big bird. And this one is easily distinguishable from, for example, the Paddyfield pipit, which occurs in the same area, and the long-billed pipit, which also occurs in the same area, by the distinctly streaked flanks. Also the head pattern is quite different. It's got a rather strong, dark laurel stripe and very poorly marked area in this part, and very heavily streaked upper parts as well. This is the song of Upland. It's almost like a tit, almost like a great tit. It's very, very different from all other pipits. And in fact, the upland pipit is not very closely related to the other large pipits that I've shown before. So all the other large pipits are closely related, but this one is different. So, sorry, I thought. Okay, so over to some of the smaller pipits. Red-throated pipit deserves its name. It's got a red throat in adult plumage. A few females actually lack red on the throat. In the old literature, it was always stated that this is summer plumage, and in winter plumage they lack the red. But that is incorrect. They've always got a rufous throat. They may get a little bit more streaking on the breast in winter plumage, but basically summer plumage and winter plumage look the same. So this is easily identifiable by its rufous throat. So a first winter bird looks like this. They don't show any rufous at all. Extremely few males actually have a few rufous feathers like this one, but in general they're just, well, like this, without rufous. And it's a very heavily striped bird, very heavy streaking on the underparts and on the upper parts, usually showing some pale tram lines here on the side, and also the rump you can't see here, and I wasn't able to fit in a bird from behind, but also the rump, if they spread the wings a bit from behind, you can see that the rump is heavily striped. Note also that, no, okay, don't note anything else, because we'll move over to this one here, the rosa pipit, which is breeding up in the Himalayas and wintering in the plains of northern India, and as well as in the Himalayas, just dropping down a bit. It breeds really, really high up in alpine elevations, so above the tree line. It's you find it in well, for example, above 4,000 meters in many places, and it's a very distinctive bird. In summer plumage, it's got a pale pinkish throat and breast, heavily striped flanks, heavy streaking on the upper parts, and very distinctive head pattern, often with a slightly isolated pale spot here. as I've shown on this bird, there are some variations. Some individuals have got a few dark spots in the center of the breast as well, and slightly less distinct. The helicopter coming back. In winter plumage, all birds look like this. So no pink, unlike the red-throated pipit, the winter plumage, the summer plumage and winter plumage are very different in adult birds. So the winter plumage of this is very similar to the red-throated pipit, and I'll show you soon comparison of those. But first I will show you the water pipit, which is quite a rare bird in India. It doesn't breed in India, but it winters up in the northwestern parts of India, quite scarcely. And in summer plumage, it's very pale on the underparts, with a very nice pale buffish color on the throat and breast, and very few streaks on the underparts, and relatively little streaking on the upper parts, relatively faintly streaked on the upper parts. In winter plumage, it's pretty different because it's got much more streaking, but really not very heavily streaked. Also on the upper parts, not very heavily streaked. So if you look at the rosy pipit here in winter plumage and the red-throated pipit in first winter plumage, you see that they are pretty similar to each other, but the head pattern is quite different. The rosy pipit's got a more prominent supercilium, which often has this little teardrop at the rear end. And it's also got rather dark lores and rather dark ear covers, often with a little diffuse pale patch here. Whereas the red-throated pipit's got paler lores and less prominent supercilium, never showing this teardrop mark. And red-throated is more heavily streaked on the upper part with these pale stripes on the side. Underparts can be very, very similar though. So the head pattern and upper part are good features. Also the bill is darker in rosy pipit, and on average it's longer and heavier in rosy than in red-throated. A red-throated's got a rather fine, thin bill with a distinct yellow base that is less distinct in rosy pipit. And then we've got the water pipit here, which is much less heavily striped, both on the upper parts and underparts. And also it's got dark legs, unlike these ones. The buff-bellied pipit, I don't really know whether it's been recorded in India yet. It has. Okay. But it's clearly a rare bird, which I'm sure is easily overlooked, and it should occur more regularly than the probably few records show. So you should really look out for that. And the buff-bellied pipit is really heavily streaked on the underpart, especially on the breast. The flanks can be sort of, well, they're always streaked, but they're less heavily striped than on a rosy and red-throated pipit. But the breast is really strongly marked, and this dark malar patch, as I call it, is very prominent. But the upper parts are very, very poorly marked. So the entire mantle and crown are almost uniform. It's not very clear clearly shown here. It's much clearer on my computer. But it's almost unstreaked, very, very faintly spotted on the upper part. And also it's got pale lores, unlike the rosy pipit, but similar to red-throated. Water pipit's got sort of intermediate lores. They're not really dark, but they're sort of intermediate. They're fairly pale. And then finally, olive-backed pipit and tree pipit. Here's olive-backed pipit. In India, you can see two different subspecies which of fairly easily separated. The northern one, Yunanensis, it breeds in Siberia, for example, Siberia, Mongolia, northern China, and it's very faintly streaked on the upper parts, these three birds. Your breeding bird, which breeds in the Himalayas, often at very high elevation, often above the tree limit, is strongly streaked on the upper parts, as you can see here. With these pictures, I also want to illustrate that this is a worn bird and this is a fresh bird. And in all pipits, when they become worn, the streaking becomes more distinct on the upper parts. So in fresh plumage, streaking is generally less distinct in pipits, and in worn plumage, the dark streaks become more apparent. And this bird here is in spring plumage, so it's not extremely fresh, especially the wings are not very fresh. Whereas this is a very freshly molted autumn bird. You see, it's much more brightly coloured. So the main difference between these two subspecies is not the general colorations; it's the streaking on the mantle. So. Olive-backed pipit is very similar to tree pipit, and here I've only illustrated the subspecies Yunanensis, which is the most widespread one. The Hodgsoni subspecies, the one that's breeding in the Himalayas, it drops down a little bit, but usually it doesn't migrate very far. Whereas Yunanensis is very widespread in the Indian subcontinent in winter. And Yunanensis is very poorly streaked on the upper parts, compared to tree pipit. Tree pipit is heavily streaked or striped on the upper parts. So fairly similar to the Hodgsoni subspecies, the Himalayan breeding subspecies of olive-backed, but actually even more heavily marked. If you look at the head pattern, these are typical birds. Olive-backed showing a very prominent white supercilium above and behind the eye, more buffish in front of the eye, whereas the supercilium of tree pipit is fairly uniformly buffish throughout with some dark thin streaks. So the supercilium is not so well marked in tree pipit. Also, olive-backed pipit usually shows a dark spot here and a pale spot there. You can just see traces of those in tree pipit. But to make things complicated, I've shown some variation in both species here. And this is an extreme olive-backed pipit with hardly any pale and dark spots on the ear coverts. Here's another bird with a really large dark patch and a very well-marked pale patch. And this bird here is sort of fairly indistinct supercilium. So here's two extreme tree pipits with really prominent markings on the ear coverts and supercilium. But these are really extreme birds, so 95% of them are fairly easily separable by the head pattern. And when it comes to Yunanensis, streaking on the upper parts. There's just some pictures to show a classic olive-backed pipit, really typical head pattern, very prominent white supercilium, buffish in front, and this large white spot there and the darker spot below. Tree pipit, much more uniform ear coverts. I've shown these two just to show how similar they can be. Here's an extreme olive-backed with very, very poor markings on the ear coverts. Still got a fairly prominent supercilium. Whereas this tree pipit is actually more distinctly patterned on the ear coverts than this olive-backed. I forgot to say that olive-backed's got on the crown, it's got a darker stripe on a thicker, darker stripe on the side, just bordering the pale supercilium. Whereas tree pipit it's very uniformly streaked on the upper parts. The calls of these two. I don't have any sound recording to play for you, but I'll try to imitate. It's a bzz, bzz, like that. And it's very similar in both species. In olive-backed, it's slightly thinner and high-pitched than in tree pipit, but basically they are very similar and difficult to distinguish by call. So that's it, and I hope you've learned something about those pipits. So thanks very much for your attention. And in case you want to learn, in case you have some questions about pipits, here's my email address. And this is where I've got my research webpage. There's possibly nothing on pipits there, or very little on pipits, but on other birds. Thank you very much.